Grüß Gott, ich heiße Rick Landmann. Ich bin der Urenkel von Gershon und Sophie Landmann, der Enkel von Josef und Regina Landmann und der Sohn von Heinz und Lisa Landmann. Aber ich bin in New York geboren, ich habe niemals in Deutschland gewohnt und ich spreche Deutsch wie ein Fünfjähriger. So entschuldige, but I will be telling my story in English. The story starts with these two people, Gershon and Sophie Landmann. They were born in the 1800s in Galicia, and the land and the border between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia, and Poland. Today it's in Ukraine. But the border changes is very important to my story. They left the area around Russia and Austro-Hungary in the late 1890s, but unlike Tevye on Fiddler on the Roof, they came to instead of going to New York, they went to Munich. And around 1900, they landed in Munich with their 5 children. Joseph, one of their 5 children, is my grandfather. They settled in 20 Ickstadtstraße, which at that time was an area where many Ostjuden, Orthodox, Hasidic Jews were living. Sadly for Sophie and Gershon, they never got a visa to leave Germany. So when my grandparents and my father and 2 sisters left Germany, Gershon was left with his wife in Munich. They were moved out of 20 Ickstadtstraße to the Judenstraße, a Judenhaus on Klenzestraße, and then the last letter that was ever sent to my family from them is this letter, and the address is Reichenbachstraße, which was the synagogue. My father said they never learned how to read or write or speak German. They only spoke Yiddish. So in order for a letter to be sent to America and get through the Nazi people who checked the mail, it had to be translated into German. So someone wrote the letter for them, begging my family to try to get them out of Nazi Germany after 1939. Sadly, both Sophie and Gershon were deported with the Munich transport to Theresienstadt, and Sophie died in June, Gershon died in July of 1942. This here is the synagogue of Reichenbachstraße, where I visited in 2005. I was hoping that this would become the home of the liberal congregation, but it never did. So here is the photograph of Josef and Regina's wedding in Augsburg after World War I. And you can see Sophie and Gershon sitting in the photograph. These people are all German, except for Sophie and Gershon. And you can tell by their dress that these are modern Jews. They had become part of German society. These are the brothers and sisters of both my grandparents and their family. Sadly, only Regina and Joseph and one other person was able to survive the Holocaust. Many of these people had married after my grandparents and had children. Some of those children, some of my father's cousins, did get out during the Kindertransport. But the people that you're seeing here, which would have been my family, did not survive. This is a picture of Heinz, my father, and his 2 sisters, Irmgard and Irma, and my grandmother in Augsburg, Germany. I'm assuming my father in his lederhosen there is probably around 6 or 7 years old. Here is the family. What's the reflection? Here is the family right before Kristallnacht, I would say around 1937. And they were all dressed up and had a professional photograph taken. And again, it's Josef, Irma, my father, Johanna, and Regina. Now, Josef was different than his other four siblings and his parents. He was born on the other side of the river in the town they were living, and the jurisdiction of that town on the year he was born was Russian. So the American consulate at first thought he was a Polish Jew living in Germany and told him to come back in a few years. But when they checked his paperwork, they realized he was a Russian Jew living in Germany. And this is after Kristallnacht. On Kristallnacht, Josef was not on the list to be arrested. They wanted him to sign over the deeds, the property of the Jewish community, such as the Sportsplatz, because they had made Joseph the head of the Sportsplatz since he was an Ostjude. He was not born in Germany. My father Heinz, he was born in Germany. He had just turned 18. He was on the list. So at 5:30 in the morning, the Gestapo came, picked up Heinz, who put on his lederhosen, and then was marched past the synagogue on Haldestrasse, saw that it was on fire, brought to the police station, and later, after 9 o'clock, Josef went to his attorney, Leopold Riese, to try to find out why was Heinz arrested. While walking on the street, someone yelled, "Josef, they're picking up the Jews." So even though he wasn't on the list, he and Leopold Riese were arrested, and my father and grandfather went to Dachau together, but my grandfather was wanted by the Gestapo to sign the papers, and when they rang his doorbell, my grandmother said, "I thought he was with you." So after checking, they found he was in Dachau and they released him. So that's how come he was able to go to the consulate and get a visa to leave Germany. Then while he was on his way to America in London, he stopped by a lawyer, Charles Aukin, who did the temporary transit visa to be able to get my father, Heinz, on April 15th as an unaccompanied teenager to go to London and wait until America would give him a visa. So without speaking English, my father turned into Henry, and he was on the streets of London, and after September 1st was an enemy alien living in London. This is the steamer trunk that Joseph left Augsburg with in 1939 and traveled to New York. I still have this steamer trunk, and I hope one day to find the right museum for it. This was their final apartment on the 3rd floor on Hermannstrasse. The Landmanns first lived in Bahnhofstrasse, then Maximilianstrasse, and then this was their final place on Hermannstrasse. Now these are the two pictures of my father. The one taken before Kristallnacht, he is thinner and has hair. The other one is his passport picture to come to America. His hair has grown back from being in Dachau, but he has been eating too much, and he is heavier now than he ever was when he came to America. This is my father at the Sportsplatz. Since they couldn't go to school anymore, many of the Jews of Augsburg spent hours of the day in the Sportsplatz. And this is one of the awards that my father received. When I went back with my parents in 1985 or 9, we found the Sportsplatz. It's a recreational center as part of a co-op or a residential apartment complex, I believe on Hohen Altweg. And we spoke to the people, and at that time they made an exhibit, I don't know if it's still there, in honor of the Jewish Sportsplatz. Now this photograph I donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's part of the Landmann collection. And in the middle, with the white handkerchief, whoops, I touched it, is Henry Landmann. This was taken the day before they landed in New York City on Thanksgiving of 1939. If you notice, it's always the same suit. Jews couldn't bring gold or valuables out of Germany, but they were able to go to the tailors and get a very good suit made. So in a way, when they would always refer to the German Jews of Washington Heights as Yekkes, because they were always wearing their suit, that was their most prized possession that they had. Okay, now my father comes to Washington Heights, and when World War II breaks out and America joins in, after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Henry joins the U.S. Army. He goes across North Africa to Sicily, to Italy. He's part of the Anzio breakout, to France. And then my father's group is in Dachau on the day that they are liberated. Colonel Porter said that my father didn't have to go into Dachau. He stayed outside and actually captured one of the important people who was running away from the inmates and wanted to surrender to the Americans. On the other side of this picture, though, is a little receipt. Regina sent money to Heinz while he was in Dachau, thinking that the money goes to the inmates. Of course, none of the inmates ever saw the money, but this showed what block and where my father was in Dachau. The other picture is taken by my father in front of Maximilianstrasse. Colonel Porter let my father and this other man take a jeep and drive into Augsburg the day or so before the official liberation to be able to see if any of his family was alive. No one was. So my father is technically the first American soldier to enter Augsburg. And here is a picture of my father as a soldier. And then when he was in his 80s, the Jewish Museum of Augsburg asked if they could have his army uniform. So my father put it on first, and I took his photograph, and then we sent it to the Jewish Museum in Augsburg. Here's a picture of it, which was just around the corner from where they lived on Hermannstrasse. And today, if you go there, his army uniform is in a permanent exhibit. I also believe his lederhosen that he wore when the Gestapo arrested him, and when the Jews after Kristallnacht got to Dachau, you put your clothing in a brown paper bag and they gave you your number that you wrote on it. If you were released, like my father was, you then got the brown paper bag back with your clothing. He then packed those lederhosen in a lift that was then shipped in around March to New York City, where my grandfather Joseph was living already in Washington Heights. So he got his lederhosen back. And growing up in Queens, I can still remember when my father had to do gardening work that was really dirty, he would wear his lederhosen. He was living on a Jewish block of all Jews. We were the only refugee family, but everyone accepted us basically for who we were during my early childhood. But those lederhosen were returned, and they've been both in an exhibit in Dachau, where someone wrote a book, Namen statt Nummern, on which my father is one of the people featured in that book. And his lederhosen, I still think, is now back in Augsburg. These, later on in life, my father took a red washcloth and a frame, and he took all of his medals and he put them on this washcloth, and this was hanging in his den. Again, I don't know what I'm going to do with all of these things. I am now in my 70s, and eventually I have to find a proper house for all of these things. Now we'll go to the next generation. So Henry now finishes the war, comes back to New York, and he meets my mother. Her name was at that time Lisa Oettinger, and they get married. So here you can see on one side my father with Joseph and Regina Landman, and on the other side Martin and Elsie Oettinger. Now on my mother's side, I'll first start with Elsie, my Oma. I don't know if I have a picture. No, okay. Actually, I'll start with my grandfather, Martin. Martin was the son of Gabriel Oettinger. His family can trace themselves back to the 1500s in Germany. He was a proud German and a virulent anti-Nazi. He grew up in the town of Uffenheim, and he fought in World War I for the Kaiser. This here is a picture of his father, taken way before World War I at the turn of the century, in Uffenheim, having beer with the police officer and the other people in his neighborhood. Uffenheim at that time had very few people, only a few hundred, and only a few Jews, but people seemed, according to the photograph here, to be getting along with each other. Sadly, Gabriel died early on, and then his wife Hanchen also died early on, leaving the 4 children as orphans during the period of World War I. This is their house in Uffenheim, and it is still there. We went and visited it in, I think, 1989. This is Martin in his army uniform with his dog Putzi. And this is Martin in his army photograph. Again, this side of the family was very short. We have brown eyes and we're short. The Landmans have blue eyes and they're much taller. I take after my grandfather. Uffenheim, as I said, was very anti-Nazi. It boasted that it was Judenfrei by around the time of 1937. And my family, the Oettingers, were one of those people that when they would put out warnings, don't buy from the Jews and boycott, this is about my family. Now, I met a woman priest in New York, and Miriam Gross, and she lives in Uffenheim. And I have to thank her daughter who did the research, who came about with all of this information. And she did a story about the Uffenheimer matzah factory. The structure is still there and the ovens are still in the basement. And when she mailed this clipping to me about the Uffenheimer matzah factory, we noticed on the bottom it says G. Landmann at 20 Ickstadtstraße. So, my father's grandfather from Munich would travel to Uffenheim for matzahs and sell them in Munich. Who knows? Walking on the street one day, my mother's grandfather, or even father, might have met Gershon Landmann. I don't know. The coincidences in my life are many. This here is a picture of Martin, and Martin went back to Germany in January of 1946 and came back with 3 Torahs. One Torah he donated to Beth Hillel, which doesn't exist anymore in Washington Heights. I believe that Torah is now in the area around Ansbach, Erfurt, Würzburg. I'm not sure which synagogue has it now. The other 2 Torahs Martin kept in case he had grandchildren, and he did. So my brother, when he turned bar mitzvah, he donated it to the synagogue in Queens. That synagogue, unfortunately, also is closed, but my brother has that Torah in California. When I turned 13, and let's see, about to get to my story, but no, I want to, before I get to that, I want to also mention my grandma, Elsie Kramer Oettinger. She was born in Friedberg. Her father, Max Kramer, was the cantor. Her aunt, Max's sister, was Helena Kramer, the friend of Bertha Pappenheim. And I am now working on figuring out what to do with the necklace that Bertha gave Helena, who gave to my grandmother Elsie, who gave it to me in 1996 with a letter saying this is very important to keep it. So Helena and Max were able to come to America because another sibling, Harry Kramer, owned a restaurant in Lower Manhattan, and he signed the affidavits. Helena was running an orphanage. They moved to France to try to save the kids. They couldn't, but Helena did get a visa to go to Cuba and then come to America, and she died in the Bronx in New York in 1977. So now we'll go to my story. This is me. I was born in New York in 1952. My mother's doctor was the Dr. Emil Mosbacher von Nürnberg, because my mother was born in Nuremberg, and I left out the important part. Martin was so anti-Nazi that he kicked Julius Streicher, the publisher of Der Stürmer, in Nuremberg, where they lived after World War I. He kicked Julius in the tuchus, in the behind. And as a result, Julius put him on the list to be arrested on the day they opened Dachau on March 23rd of 1933. But Martin was tipped off, and when he saw the SA coming at work, he went out the back way, went to the railroad station, and went to Strasbourg. My grandmother and mother then followed him to Strasbourg, and they lived there from 1933 to 39. When they saw the synagogues burning in Germany, they were able to get a visa thanks to Harry Kramer and come to America. So that side of the family was basically saved, of the ones who I know. They got here in the early part of 39. My father got here on November, his mother and two sisters over the summer, and Yosef in the early part. So now, here's me. Now, before my bar mitzvah, at around 12, I had a fight with my Hebrew school over gay marriage. We were learning how boys and girls get married, and I wasn't going to be marrying a girl. So I raised my hand and I asked if two boys could get married. After getting yelled at so much, I said, well, they're not getting the Torah. One day there'll be a gay-friendly Torah, a gay-friendly synagogue, and I'll bring the Torah there. So we wrote a contract that on 90 days' notice, I could take the Torah back from the synagogue where I was a child. But my grandfather gave me a Megillah instead. Since my brother did a donation, he wanted me to do a donation. So I had donated this Torah to the synagogue. It is now closed. I have the Megillah back, and I am trying to figure out a way to donate it to a museum in Uffenheim if they would create a permanent collection for the Jews who lived in the area and make it in honor of my grandma and grandpa, and on Purim allow a local synagogue to be able to read from it. I read from it this year. It's still in very good condition for being 200 years old. And my grandfather's Hebrew name was Mordechai, as is mine. My grandmother's Hebrew name was Esther. So Purim is a big part of our tradition. And my brother is in the background along with Rabbi Poplak with the glasses and Cantor Wolf. This is a close-up of the Megillah that I'm hoping to figure out the proper home for it in Germany. Now, at 13, that is my bar mitzvah. It was the last Shabbat in June of 1965. Ironically, On that last weekend, 4 years later, will be the Stonewall Rebellion in New York City, which was a catalyst to boost the gay rights movement or the LGBTQ rights movement in New York. So I often give a speech about being bar mitzvahed on Gay Pride Shabbat, but 4 years ahead of Stonewall. But at this time is when I began really coming out. I told my Jewish counselor in my Jewish summer camp in the Catskills that I had a crush on Wayne. He was straight, but he invited me to his wedding, and we're still good friends. That was a pivotal year for me understanding who I am. And then I told my parents that one day I'm hoping there'll be a gay synagogue. And my mother in 1973 read about Congregation Bet Simchas Torah and told me to get dressed and go to shul. So CBST, which is still my synagogue, I am probably one of the longest running members of my synagogue. And the Torah did go to CBST for many years until I read about the conflicts between the Orthodox and the liberal community, Jewish community in Munich. And I contacted some of the people there from the World Progressive Union. And I decided that was the place that I wanted the Torah to go to. So, in 2004, every year since around 1990, I did a Kristallnacht program at my synagogue, CBST. And for that year, I could only do it once. I decided to have the signing ceremony of the contracts that I signed to be able to donate the Torah. So, and then there's a picture of my grandfather standing by one of his Torahs. I think this is the one from that went to Germany first. This is the Torah that I donated to Munich, to Congregation Beth Shalom. Now, one of their members, board members, who's now a rabbi, Adrian Schell, came to Greenwich Village in New York and attended that service. And here is the photograph of him signing the paperwork which donated the Torah to go back to Beth Shalom. Here is a close-up of the Torah with somebody else's silver on it. That wasn't ones that my grandfather had. Here is a picture of me and Adrian boxing up the Torah. He carried it back to Munich. He actually had it in the seat next to him on the airplane, and they went to Munich. Here he's unpacking the Torah in Munich at Congregation Beth Shalom. Here they're reviewing the Torah. And here we are at a processional. Now, when I went to Germany in 2005, I knew I could understand German. I didn't know I could speak it. So I wrote 3 speeches. One for when I was in front of my great-grandparents' house on 20 Ickstadtstraße, where we started the processional. One for when we got into the shul, I gave a speech there. And then since it was Shavuot that year in 2005, and also my birthday, I was going to give an hour talk in the evening on a Shavuothon, a studying of Torah. My part was going to be on the history of the Torah. But about a day or so before, people took me out for my birthday. And they bought me a Rad Lamas at dinner time. And they said it's mostly lemonade and some beer. So when they delivered it, I was waiting for glasses because I thought that was a pitcher and that you pour it into glasses. But they said, nein, this is für dich. So while everyone is talking, I am drinking this Rad Lamas. And after a while, I'm a little bit tipsy. And something happens in my brain where instead of listening to all the German, translating it into English, and speaking it out in English, I started speaking German. And they said, ach, natürlich kannst du Deutsch. I said, ja, ich kann ein bisschen Deutsch, aber ich weiß gar nichts von der, die oder das. And they said, it doesn't matter. Tomorrow, or whenever the next day was that we were giving the speeches, don't do it in English. Just speak from your heart. We don't care if you know der, die oder das or grammar. So I stood in front of 20 Ickstadtstraße and I spoke to my great-grandparents. And I explained how only one of their children survived, Josef. And he had 3 children that they knew about who did survive. But that Heinzele married a woman who was born in Nuremberg, and it was her father who brought this Torah to America that I am now bringing back to Germany. And in honor of both sides of my family, I am dedicating this in honor of Martin and Elsie Oettinger and of Gershon and Sophie Landmann. And we walked, here's the picture of us starting off, we walked from there all the way through the streets of München to get to the synagogue. Here I am inside their first place. They're not there anymore. I believe they had a fire. But I'm standing behind or in front of a green parochet, a ark cover. And I don't know why I snooped and turned over the edge on the bottom of the parochet. And I was amazed. It says that the wife of Rabbi Berwald, who was the rabbi at the time of Beth Hillel when my mother and father were married, he came to their apartment and married them. This parochet is in his honor. I believe his wife bought it. And then through some long story of being in a flea market and then someone delivering it and giving it to them, it is now again united. That Torah, before I brought it to the synagogue in Queens, was in Congregation Beth Hillel in Washington Heights, in the same synagogue where that parochet is from. Again, talk about Beshert. So, to conclude this talk, I am not sure what's going to happen with this video. I am going to send it to Rabbiner Tam in München. I am also sending it to everyone who I think of that is related to something in Germany. My goal is to make several videos like this. The next one will be for Augsburg, then maybe one for Uffenheim, then maybe one for Friedberg, then maybe one for Nuremberg. And I'm hoping that these videos can somehow also help for some sort of discussions. The rabbi in München already suggested that we do a podcast to be able to discuss or answer any questions. Now, the other thing is, in 1997, I started a website, www.infotrue, with an E at the end, .com. Much of what I discussed today can be found on that website if you go and look under my family stories. But I also self-published last year during COVID my memoir. Now, the thing is, it's only part 1. I'm not dead yet, and I'm still going to be writing part 2. But I wanted during COVID to have something to do, so I self-published this book. It is available, but not at Amazon or Barnes & Nobles, and I don't know how in Germany you'll have to figure it out. But if you go to my website and click on the page, there is a link to the publisher of Shakespeare and Company, and I am assuming somehow you'll be able to figure out how to purchase it in Germany. But as I said, my goal is to write part 2, and then I'll discuss how to market it and what I will do with it. So now that I'm in my 70s and I am retired, I'm no longer a lawyer, I'm no longer a professor, My goal is to figure out how to teach about the history of the German Jewish community, remembering that I was brought up with a German Jewish culture. I'm brought up with the Washington Heights culture. This culture doesn't exist anywhere anymore. It's not the same as in Israel, and it's not even the same as the Jewish community in Germany today. And my parents' generation, I still take care of my mom. She's 95. My father died 7 or so years ago. So there's very, very few people left of my parents' generation. So I've sort of taken upon myself to further discussions and learning, and especially in today's world where demagogues are popping up, where democracies are being threatened, where the big lie theory is being used throughout the world as a form of politics to be able to choose a scapegoat and be able to attack the scapegoats as a way of trying to destroy the democracies. I think it's even more important that people have to learn what happened in Germany, starting all the way with the putsch, and then all the way through until the war starts, until the war ends. In my country, in America now, there are serious concerns not to teach the history of America. But instead, I would prefer to be like Germany is today. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, when I went to Germany to visit, there was not much being discussed. But in today's world, the curriculum, the accountability that I meet when I discuss things with Germans is much greater than what I hear of certain parts of the United States and their desire not to study what was going on. So again, this was my first video. I am now a little bit over. I wanted to do it for 30 minutes. But if you can think of how you can use this video or others, you can contact me through my email at infotru.com. I would be more than willing to figure out where do I go from here. Vielen Dank und auf Wiedersehen.